Hi, Namaste. I'm absolutely enthused to be invited by the first ever evidence based traditional medicine conference that has been organized by Stanford. I thank the organizers for having me here, sharing my thoughts with all of you. And I hope that I am able to share the very useful wisdom that lies in traditional medicine concepts by the focus on nutrition. I have chosen to talk about integrative Ayurveda nutrition, an idea that has been evolving in my mind for the past 10 years. I have been in traditional Indian medicine practice for about 2 decades. And since the past 10 years, I have actively tried to weave in the useful concepts from modern nutritional sciences into my practice. When I weave in the fundamentals from both systems, I'm able to make a significant difference in the health of the people who seek my advice. And also, I'm able to share the concepts with the students who have been learning from me through various academies. Today is another opportunity, and the opportunity presented at Stanford by potentially applying cutting edge science to these functional practices is enormous. And I'm enthused by the impact that good science can have when we apply those methodologies to these practices. So let's begin with the history of nutrition. And it's just less than a century ago that the first vitamin was actively isolated and synthesized. And that was vitamin A. And that was the age when all the nutrient deficiencies got identified, and so many diseases that plagued humanity we were able to address them. With the advent of the organic chemistry being added to the nutritional sciences, we were further able to characterize macronutrients and understand calories and energy, the idea of energy content of foods, and quantify it. So there were big strides that were made from the 1920s onwards. And this was a predominant rhetoric until the 1990s, I would say, where there was a focus on the input, ideas of the input, and an increasing conversation about the output for the energy needs that came into the public conversation. The limitation of this model was felt in the clinics for nutrition, in the clinics of nutritionists and diabetologists, and people who started working actively for chronic disease mitigation. The lack of nutrient differentiation was then further pursued through different sciences, and that led to the emergence of integrative nutrition, the way in which I see it, where there was increased conversation of macronutrient differentiation in terms of, for example, the glycemic index of carbohydrates, the different fatty acids, and the role of fatty acids and amino acids. And there were very clean products that were designed using that science so that people could make use or take advantage of this understanding. However, what I see currently with the advanced integrative nutrition, including all the ideas of keto diets and intermittent fasting and all the other different approaches for fixing the nutrition problem, I see that there is a lack of understanding of the individual ability to process those nutrients. And there is also an increased dependency on external products for health, which sometimes makes life more complicated, more expensive, more difficult for people who are seeking help and are already in a mindset of fear. Meanwhile, in the 2000s onwards, there was an Ayurveda rhetoric that caught everybody's eye because it came with the premise that every individual is unique and we need to be able to understand that and respect that. And a lot of the people directly sought Ayurvedic advice and Ayurvedic methods to incorporate in their practices. All of this in the Western context, when Ayurveda came in the Western context, it simplified home cooking. There was an introduction of the use of spices, and there were creative options for plant-based nutrition that were shared. However, popular Ayurvedic nutrition does not have the ability to factor in modern nutritional understanding. It also seems to be restrictive by giving Prakriti-based or constitution-based food lists of what one must have and not have, which is not the idea in Ayurveda itself. It is ridden with many myths. So now we are in 2021. We are trying to synthesize all of this information, all of these questions and debates into a path forward. And I present to you the idea of integrative Ayurveda nutrition. I'm not here to share the whole expanse of Ayurvedic nutrition, but the key concepts, if we weave them in our advice, look for data, look for outcomes, and then ask questions and create study designs, we might be able to identify patterns that we are looking for that will help us predict in what kind of client population, what kind of people population, what responses are relevant. So the first idea is the role of processor in health and disease. And I don't know if you recognize this instrument, but it is a bomb calorie meter. And this is what has been used in modern nutritional sciences to quantitate the amount of calories in different foods. So what they do is that they put the food inside the bomb calorie meter and burn it. And they measure the amount of heat that's generated, and that is equal to the kilocalorie energy content of the food. Now, there are a lot of adjustments for physiology in terms of the fibers and all, which actually do not get digested. And after those adjustments, they create some values, which then go onto the food labels. Now, we do not expect every human body to process it in the way in which the bomb calorie meter processes it, even after the buffers, because every individual is different. So what are the kind of concerns that are there for the processing of the same calorie? So we have different disease states, different pathophysiological states, and different physiological states that impact how much energy are we going to derive from the food that we have just consumed. So there is an input, and then there is something that's happening inside our body, which is a black box. And then there is an output. I want to make a statement that the traditional Ayurveda knowledge can make that black box into a treasure chest. Okay. How so? So if you look at the nutritional process, we have the the input going in the black box, generating an output. What are the kind of outputs that we see? The outputs are stools, tissue production, functional energy, satiety, and appetite, right? These are the food that we eat. Eventually, it leads to these certain gross and subtle experiences. Okay. Now, when we look at this, when we look at the stools and we apply the lens of Ayurveda, it gives us a lot of insight into what's happening in the black box. Similarly, when this process is well executed, we also find that there is satiety in the food, that people feel satisfied by the food, and then appetite returns after some hours later. So the satiety and appetite, when does it return? That is another cue into the black box. If this process is not occurring well, then there is an impact on the processor. Just as if you imagine the bomb calorimeter, if you put in the slice of bread inside and it doesn't get combusted completely, there is some sort of a residue that's going to remain. And that's going to affect the functioning of the processor gradually. So that's another insight that we can get. The quality of tissue production eventually impacts the functional energy that the person experiences as well. The satiety and appetite and the functional energy, they impact the person's mood and cognition. And the person's mood and cognition eventually also influences the input. Now, all of these things are experiences that we've all had, but we need to put them all into a framework that is functional, that has labels and there are tags in it. There are more details here, but this is the core of it. So when we consume food, the body spends some energy to transform it into tissues. When that is well executed, it creates a very nice, clean, nourishing essence. And that goes down further in the nutrient chain, nourishing the lymphatic tissue, the vascular components, the muscular tissue, the adipose tissue, the skeletal tissue, the neuronal tissue, the reproductive tissue, and eventually gives vitality, strength, immunity, stamina. So food is going from a very gross mass form into a very subtle energy form. And all of this can be experienced by us on a day-to-day basis. When this process is not well executed, it creates a disease-causing residue, which has its own signal, which we can identify even on an individual basis. Depending on the nature of food, the nature of this residue is different energetically. That brings me to the second concept of the behavioral determinants of healthy transformation. That this process is not something that the body is doing that we can't do anything about. We can do a lot about it. And some of the key areas that we can influence are when we eat, how much we eat, how we eat, and what we eat. And the what and the how much have been questions that modern nutrition has addressed, but it has not taken adequately into account the Ayurvedic process of the transformation. And if we are able to do that and inform the nutritionists who are helping, the health coaches who are helping millions of people in this country and worldwide, we will have better results, is a statement that I make. One very interesting study that came about when we eat, that is the Spanish study that measured the amount of weight loss in two groups who had the same amount of calorie intake, but one of the groups had most of the calories before 3 p.m. and the other one after 3 p.m. There was an additional weight loss of 5 pounds in the before 3 p.m. group. That really talks about the chronobiology of nutrition. And there are multiple other studies that exist in the literature, not enough human, but many in other species. From an Ayurveda perspective, one of the key messages that I actually would give out to almost everybody is to make lunch the largest and the most important meal of the day and not breakfast. And there is a perfectly valid Ayurvedic logic to that. And it really sets into motion a lot of things that self-correct and auto-regulate. It is based on the concept of when Kapha, Pitta, and Vata rise in the body. And we're trying to take advantage of maximum Pitta in the system. That is when the body has the maximum transformational ability. This is another set of data which is unpublished, but from 771 non-diseased Indian males many years ago. This was done by Professor Alex Hankey and his student, where they looked at BMI and meal timings. They just asked a cross-sectional question. And they found that people who had their main meal after 2 p.m. had a significant number of them had elevated BMI. And this was done in India, so the BMI cutoffs are lower than international standards. They are at 25. You're overweight in India at 25 instead of at 30. So this was at 547 of them had meals after 2 p.m., the main meal after 2 p.m. And the significance of this data distribution was p lesser than 0.0001. But such simple studies can be carried out to further inform our suggestions if needed. The third concept that is overlooked in modern nutrition but has extreme importance in Ayurveda is the balance of tastes. And I shared here a sutra. A sutra is a Sanskrit, is a description of how excessive salty food causes a plethora of diseases. Now we know about the association of salt and hypertension and certain cancers. But here there is an association with skin disorders, edema, fertility, early graying of hair, excessive hair loss, hyperacidity, herpes, gout, eczema, and alopecia. So I chose to focus on hyperacidity. Is this true that salt causes hyperacidity? And I found this paper that was shared by my mentor, and he had done this early in 1969, a clinical pharmacology study when they measured gastric acid secretion on a maximal histamine test by giving people low sodium diets. And there were 18 patients enrolled. There were 12 of them who had duodenal ulcers and 6 were normal. And they went 14 weeks without dietary salt, which is intense. But there was a significant drop in the gastric acid output. So this was one clinical study. But when you look at more literature epidemiologically, you see that Japanese populations who have increased salt intake, they also tend to have more incidence of gastritis and gastric ulcers. There are a lot of clinical observations which are all validated by studies. They have references for all of these. There are experiments in humans like the one that I just shared. And there are a lot of in vivo and in vitro studies that talk about salt. And now hyperacidity is associated also with Helicobacter pylori. And there are studies showing an increase in virulence and growth of H. pylori in a salty environment. So you see some of this evidence generating from multiple levels of biological organization. Now, when something like this occurs, if there is a reasonable degree of proof for salt impacting hyperacidity, there can be a way to inform the health practitioners to change this for so many people who are suffering from it. Another dimension that is emerging for tastes, particularly, salt is different and salty taste is different because salt is sodium chloride can have its own influence as a chemical marker, but taste itself, there is now but for taste itself, there is now basic science advances that shows that taste receptors are located not just on the tongue, but throughout the body, probably throughout the digestive system, the respiratory system, the brain, spermatozoa, the testes, and many other places where they're still investigating. So what is the influence of this taste on all the other organs? Ayurveda has a deep understanding of the physiological and the pathological potential of different tastes, and it advises us to balance the tastes on our plate. So it is yet another avenue for balance. So which taste do you prefer? When I ask people in my clinic, I find sweet, sour, salty, yes, but I was surprised to find more salty than sweet. And the other tastes are not eaten enough. And this is where Ayurveda comes in with its herbs and its spices, because most of the herbs and spices are pungent, bitter, or astringent. Okay, so that's where we balance out the energetics in the body. So what is a healthy food choice? It is the one that generates satisfaction. It ensures return of appetite at the next meal. It produces quality tissue and energetics. It helps to maintain mental clarity and moods, and it provides energy until the next meal. This is what I define as healthy. Healthy is not an external label. Healthy is the outcome of a process, and a process that we can share, that is experiential, that can be solidified, and that can be framed better for better education. And asking a lot of questions to it for research is also possible. But once we have that fundamental education that we share, people can depend on themselves for their health and healthy nutrition choices. They don't have to look for it in a product outside. It can become intuitive. It can become inclusive because you can have a variety of foods that allow for nutrition. And if you make a mistake, there is forgiving, because you learn as to what something did to your system and you have a frame to put it into a context. And because you can do that, it can become sustainable. And because something is sustainable, it can be enjoyable. It can bring people together. I want to begin concluding by this sutra, which I really feel inspired by, which is the impact on cognition. And it says, Ahara Shuddhe Sattva Shuddhi. Shuddhe Sattve Dhruvamati. So when food is clean, the mind is pure. And when the mind is pure, the intellect quickly returns in charge to make better decisions. So for evidence, I ask you to look within in terms of your own experiences with everything that I have shared. And if you understand the science aspect of it that comes from traditional sciences and the emergent evidence that we have a small trickle of, all of these can inform our choices. And this is truly the nature of evidence that we might need to create for traditional medicine. And with that, with the hope that Stanford will begin to scratch the surface of traditional medicine, I hope that this conference can create history in bringing people together to investigate the wealth that we have, the wealth of humanity. Thank you.